Today we are going to walk through open access, more specifically as it relates to research data. But first, I just want to recognize that this is Open Access Week. This week is an opportunity to learn about and share and inspire participation in open access. This year's theme is Who Owns Our Knowledge, which encourages us to think about pathways to more equitable knowledge sharing. So this is our roadmap for today. We're going to review first what we mean by research data, and then we'll go into defining open data and look at some examples of where you might be able to find some data. We'll look at why open data is important, what we might need or want to share, and some challenges and restrictions that we may need to be aware of. Then we'll review some strategies that you can take away to start making your own data more open. And then we will end with some resources that are available to you. Okay, so first we're going to look at what research data is and maybe also what it isn't, depending on your context. So ODU maintains a research and scholarly digital data management policy. And according to this policy, research data is digitally recorded information necessary to support or validate a research project's observations, findings, or outputs. And put another way in this podcast was, what are the inputs or outputs of your research without which you could not have drawn your conclusions? So depending on your discipline, what are considered data can and will be different. It all depends on the context of your research. So any of these might be considered data, including spreadsheets, surveys, audio and video, model simulations, archival material, and historic documents. Researchers may collect their own data, or they may use data that's previously been collected or generated by someone else. Data might be quantitative or qualitative, or your methodology could include both. Data can also be observational, experimental, simulated, and or compiled. I've added a slide of resources at the end that goes into a little bit more depth on data types. I think it's also important to note that not everything related to your research project is going to be considered data under certain definitions. So for example, the National Institutes of Health state that things like laboratory notebooks, preliminary analyses, drafts and peer reviews and plans, and also physical objects are not included in their definition of data. Okay, so now we're going to look at what we mean by open data. So in its truest form, open data is data that can be freely used, reused, and redistributed by anyone. And that reuse generally implies usage of a data set by someone other than the originator. But you, of course, may come back and reuse your own research data. Open data enables people to use it, build on it, and then also share those resulting outputs. The National Library of Medicine definition also emphasizes the secondary use of data, and the definition recognizes a spectrum of openness, from freely available to highly restricted. So there's no one size fits all when it comes to making data more open. And some things can and shouldn't be shared. In addition, the definition references the FAIR principles of being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we're going to come back to these in a couple slides when we talk about strategies for making your data more open. So various people, institutions, agencies, etc., may make data open and publicly available. That can happen at the state level, the city level, the agency level. Some examples are the Virginia Open Data Portal. There's the Norfolk Open Data Portal. I know Virginia Beach also has one, and other cities in the state. The agencies themselves might have open data portals, such as the Department of Transportation. So these aim to make data open at no cost, with the intent that others will use the data provided for their own needs. There are also national and international sources of open data. The US government maintains data.gov, and other agencies may have their own data portals. Internationally, the World Health Organization and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development provide access to their data as well. And then there are also repositories and archives where researchers can store and make their data publicly available. There are so many repositories out there, and I've just linked a couple here, including the Qualitative Data Repository, which is mainly for qualitative or multi-method research, Pangea, which focuses on earth and environmental science, and then Vivly, which focuses on clinical research. So open data is part of a larger ecosystem and the open science movement, which, according to UNESCO, aims at making scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable. They also highlight key elements, including open access to research products, but also the underlying infrastructure, and then open engagement with society as a whole. So in a more traditional workflow, researchers may produce a variety of outputs, including data, code, methods, visualizations, websites, exhibitions, but it's been typical in the past to only release a final peer-reviewed paper in a journal. So open research aims to make the additional components of research, including protocols, registrations, and data and code openly available as well. So why might we want to make our data more open? So data might, and probably often is, collected for a very specific purpose to answer a research question, but research data can have value beyond their original purpose and can inform new research questions and facilitate new discoveries. Some data can be expensive and very resource intensive to collect. And some data, such as observations of a specific event or time-constrained phenomenon, might not be able to be reproduced at all. So open data can make research more accessible, inclusive, reproducible, and transparent. And then this can all increase the trust that people have in your research. This is a neat example of a research project called the Old Weather Time Machine. They aim to create a high-resolution, four-dimensional reconstruction of the global climate that estimates the weather for every day back to 1836. And part of the reconstruction efforts included looking at observations from archival records, which were transcribed by citizen volunteers. So this project involved a wide range of not only data, but also people. And through this, scientists can better understand climate conditions and their impact. In addition, open data may be a requirement of funders and journals that you work with. So the U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy has issued 2 memorandums, and these memorandums seek to increase public access to research and research data that's publicly funded. So taxpayers should have timely access to the research outputs that they fund. These public access policies are going into effect now and must be in effect by the end of the year. And you can search for specific agency requirements on this Spark website, which is linked here. Many journals also support open data initiatives, and you may notice the more prominent presence of data availability statements. These are becoming a lot more widespread. They provide information on where a user can find the data associated with the research article, and if the data cannot be shared in some way, that should also be stated in that availability statement. Okay, so what data should actually be shared in practice? So different disciplines, as we mentioned, recognize different research products as data, and different funders may also have different definitions of what should be shared. So we kind of went over the NIH expectations, which do not include physical objects, but the NSF definition implies that samples are included in data that needs to be shared. The National Endowment for the Humanities, for this particular advancement grant, included software code, algorithms, and any digital tools that were created during the project. And some disciplines, such as those that produce a substantial amount of data through modeling or simulations, some of them are still working through what exactly should be shared, since those data sets can get very large very quickly. You may also hear about making data as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. So advocates of open data don't necessarily think that everything should be made available. And there are a lot of valid reasons that some data would not be made public, at least not at a very granular level. So some of these considerations include data that has information about indigenous populations, personally identifiable information, information that might have environmental or conservation concerns, such as the location of endangered species, as well as data that is proprietary, under the review for a patent, or of national interest. Some things we might be able to do to mitigate some of these concerns are gaining informed consent at the beginning or before the project starts for data sharing in the future, de-identifying data, releasing data in more broad or aggregated forms. But there still may be instances where the data need to be under controlled or restricted access. And in some cases, that's completely reasonable. So people need to go through some sort of process to gain access to that data. The best time to think about data sharing and making your data more open is at the beginning of your project. So here you should be thinking about requirements that are pertinent to you, whether they are institutional, funder, or journal related. You should think through what can or maybe cannot be shared and how you might go about doing that. Many funders require now what's called a data management plan, but it's a good idea whether or not your project is funded and whether or not you plan to share or not share your data. A data management plan helps you think through and document the types of data that you'll collect, how you'll document that data. It helps you think through your storage, backup, and security plans. And with that, if there are privacy and confidentiality concerns that will impact your plans. A data management plan will also include information on how you plan to, as we're talking about, preserve, share, and disseminate your data, as well as the roles and responsibilities around data management. It might just be you managing your data, but you might have a team. So does everyone know their expectations and functions when it comes to data? Okay, I'm going to pause quickly here before we move into making our strategies for making your data more open. So does anyone have any questions so far?
I have a question.
Yes.
So if you say you publish your study and you don't go the open access route and you use the traditional publishing route, but you have a data set that kind of goes along with it. I know that they don't always publish that data with your article. Could you deposit your data into an open repository and your article?
Yes.
Okay.
You can. That is one of those things, though, that will make your data less discoverable if only certain people can access the article, unless they're looking, specifically in that repository, maybe, and that data set comes up that then is related to that article. But yes, you can do that, and you probably will be asked to do that by certain journals, regardless of whether you're doing open access or not. I would just say that it would make your article and your data a little less discoverable overall, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so we're going to move into some strategies. So if you're interested in making your data more open, or perhaps you do have a requirement to do so, what are some things that we can start doing? First, I just want to reiterate why open data matters. So it can have value beyond the original purpose. It can inform new research questions. It can provide access to data that was either not being able to be reproduced or expensive and resource intensive. However, it can make research more accessible, inclusive, transparent, only if you can actually access that data, find that data, use that data. So it has to be in a usable format. It has to be accompanied by thorough documentation, and it needs to be somewhere that is discoverable and accessible. And that's kind of where the FAIR principles that we briefly mentioned when we looked at the NIH definition of data are trying to facilitate. So we should aim to make data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. You may also hear about the CARE principles, which complement the FAIR principles and aim to define the rights, interests, and concepts to be employed in facilitating Indigenous control when it comes to data governance and reuse. So for the next couple slides, I'm going to go use the FAIR principles as a guide and just outline a couple suggestions if you're thinking about making your data more open. So the first one is actually making your data findable. So we can make our data findable by using a repository for your data. So these are a centralized place to hold data, share data publicly, and organize your data. We looked at a couple previously, QDR, Vivly. There's a whole lot out there, which I'll go into in a little bit. We generally want to use a repository where other people in your discipline are going to be able to find it. So sometimes you might have a repository defined by a grant, and that's fantastic. You can just use the one that's already defined. Your second choice would be to choose a repository, as I said, that's discipline specific. So other people in your discipline will know where to find it. NIH has see if I can move this over so everyone can see it. And NIH has this supported data sharing resources. So they have this domain specific or discipline specific repositories. So they have repositories only for traumatic brain injury research. Let's see. There are a lot of different spinal cord injury. So if you're looking for something very specific, there might be things out there, and then people will know where to get your data or find your data. However, there might not be a specific repository for all disciplines yet. And in that case, there are reputable generalist repositories that do support a wide range of data and formats. This is the generalist repository ecosystem. Let's see if I can click on it. There we go. Which has been supported by NIH. So it is a initiative to develop collaborative approaches to data management within all of these different generalist repositories. So if I go to Dryad, for instance, we can see that it'll take data in any file format from any field of research. So if there isn't a specific repository, you can start looking at these more generalist repositories. Okay. And so depositing your data in a repository, it can seem pretty daunting at first, and you do want to, research the repository that you may want to use. There's a lot of help out there. Repositories themselves often have lots of help documentation, guides, FAQs, webinars, help desks, all the above. In addition, sometimes your upload can be mediated by a curator, who is someone who will give your data some level of review, and you can collaborate on the upload. They can help make sure you have the appropriate metadata, look at any data confidentiality issues. So if that's important to you, you may want to look at a repository that offers those types of services. Generally, the process is similar between repositories. Everyone's going to have maybe different forms and things like that. But generally, you will be asked to create an account and then create a new upload. You're going to fill in kind of a walkthrough metadata, so types of files, the title, authors, description, all that sort of things associated with your data. You'll upload it. You might have some other options. So if you're not ready, you could save it for later, or you could put an embargoed access so you don't release it publicly for a certain amount of time, because maybe you want it only to come out as soon as your article is published, but you want to get ahead of it and do it ahead of time. And then you will publish your article or your data, and it will be available publicly. So in addition to being findable, your data also needs to be accessible to people who may want to use it. So we talked briefly about data availability statements, and this might be required depending on your journal to clearly indicate what data was used or generated by your research, and also where to find it. This is an example from PLOS, where there is a data availability statement down here. And it also has a data badge. So it's trying to make it very clear that yes, this article has data and this is where you go to get that data. The dataset also has a DOI, a digital object identifier, and this helps provide a persistent, unique, and stable identifier for your data. And you want to make sure that the access to your data is clear. So if there are any restrictions or authentication processes, you want to make that clear to the user. This is an example of a data set from ICPSR, and it tells us clearly in red, one or more files in this data collection have special restrictions. And then it goes on to tell us that these are not available for a direct download, but please click on the restricted data button up here to learn more about how the user would go about accessing that data. Interoperability of your data makes finding, accessing, and reusing data easier for others. If your data is interoperable, it's easily integrated with other systems and data. So data can be more interoperable when you're using file formats that are easily opened with a variety of software. CSV for tables, JPEG for images. It's not in a proprietary form. You can also use controlled vocabularies or vocabularies that are relevant to your discipline. So that way you are describing your data consistently in the vocabularies that others will be using when they're searching for your data. Standardization can also occur on the data collection side. This is an example from NIH called the Common Data Elements. So this repository provides defined questions and allowable responses that can be used across different studies. And this helps researchers collect data in a more consistent way so that those studies can then be integrated after the fact. For people to reuse your data, they also need to understand it. So documentation, also called metadata, is essential for understanding your data, not only for people who want to reuse your data, but for you and your research team as well. So including comprehensive documentation can make your data more reusable because researchers will understand pretty much the who, what, where, when, and why of your data. Documentation can take a lot of forms. So you could have a README file, data dictionaries and code books. So this will help explain things like headers and abbreviations, units of measurement. Maybe there's missing values. What does that mean? What were your methods? What equipment did you use? What versions of software did you use? Clearly documenting your methods and versions will ensure that people know what you did, why you did it, when you did it, and if it's applicable, what is the most authoritative version of your data? So before we close, I just want to provide a couple more resources. This is more of the types of data, primary research, social science data, what's the difference, that sort of thing. I did want to put a couple more things about making your data more open as far as documenting data. Cornell has a really nice example of a README file that you might want to use. If I click on that really quick, it's just a template and it goes into who did it, why you did it, descriptions, methods, file formats. You can look at file format considerations, the recommended formats from the Library of Congress, and then just some examples of controlled or more specific vocabularies that you might use when describing your data. On campus, we have the IT, Technology Services Department. They offer research computing support, data storage options, guidelines for sensitive and regulated data. They do some trainings for the high performance computing. So if you have any of those needs, they're a great resource. The Division of Research and Economic Development can help with grant and funding development, all of the compliance side of things, IRB, responsible conduct of research, innovations, commercializations, and they also have the Office for Undergraduate Research as well. There are several centers and institutes that might be of interest to you on campus, including Social Science Research Center, the Center for Geospatial Science, Education, Analytics, the Center for Economic Analysis and Policy, and also the Center for Faculty Development. And finally, ODU Libraries resources. So we have subject specialists that you can make an appointment with to discuss any of your research needs, as well as research guides, including one on data management. We have librarians that are skilled in other areas such as citation management, open access, OER, and publishing. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask us. Thank you so much for joining today. I know this is a lot to take in. I hope you have a little bit clearer picture of what open data is, how it works, and some strategies you can use to start making your data more open.